Thank you. My comments are titled Liberation and Decolonial Vertigo. I grew up in a household that made me skeptical of easy rhetorics of liberation. My family had ended up in North America because they needed to escape along a knife's edge between two powerful eliminationist projects, Nazi extermination on the one side, the Red Army's so-called liberation on the other. I won't ask for a show of hands, but just as a thought experiment. Yes or no, was Poland liberated by the Red Army during World War II? Do we agree that the Soviet invasion of September of 1939 was indeed a, quote, march of liberation, as Putinist historical narrative has demanded in recent years? Or should we wait for 1945 to call it true liberation? If it was liberation in 1945, we can probably agree on what people in those territories were liberated from, but what were those people liberated into? Was the Red Army's liberation contingent upon a new form of subjugation? Who can imagine what a just liberation would have looked like for ordinary people, powerless people in those territories and in those years? Would this contentious history be more settled if liberation were in fact always accompanied by an unambiguously positive moral charge, or if liberation suggested an enduring structure of justice? And just to be honest about where we are today, I might also ask how many of the US citizens in this room consented then or consent now to our government's militarized liberation of Iraq? But we don't need to adjudicate these historical inheritances of World War II or the more recent American past in order to acknowledge how alive they are in the world today, as rhetorics of liberation emanate from above and below, from the mouths of state officials who serve Putin and Putin himself, and from much less powerful elites, like us, scholars in the Neoliberal Academy, who search for decolonizing remedies from below, or perhaps more accurately from the middle. In Putin's mouth, the Russian army and its allies today claim to fight to liberate Ukrainians not only from the fever dream of a neo-Nazi regime in Kyiv, but also from its neo-colonial dependence on the West, ostensibly to subjugate it to Russia anew. To the Ukrainian government, liberation may refer to the defeat of the nuclear-armed Russian Goliath, a fight that must be won somehow without escalation and through tragic dependency on a feckless Europe and a cynical and incoherent United States. Which liberation is your liberation if you can only choose one? Whose freedom fighter or terrorist would you choose to advance your liberation struggle? Walter Mignolo, the luminary of decolonial thought, asked us long ago to discard that old Eurocentric Cartesian maxim, I think, therefore I am, and replace it with his preferred decolonial slogan, I am where I think. Mignolo is clear that he does not mean that he should think from where he is situated in a private office in one of the wealthiest private universities in the United States, but rather projects himself into the thinking of others he finds sympathetic, from whom he can mine wisdom before translating it into exclusionary language to subvert the, quote, epistemological zero point of Western thought, by which he means the hubristic and universalizing position that masks its, quote, geo-historical body location, end quote. Since 2022, Mignolo has offered little to my explorations of decolonial thought except for implicit support for Putin's war against Ukraine, which he and some of his intellectual allies perceive to be decolonial and liberatory in the grand scheme of things. His argument seems to presuppose that Putin's Russia is interested in, quote, delinking from the colonial matrix of power, and utterly fails to accurately diagnose Russia's neo-imperial threat. As statues and tokens of Russian imperial greatness proliferate throughout the avenues of occupied, or as the Putinists would have it, liberated, Ukrainian cities, as Putinist historical narratives swell with sympathy to patriarchal dictators and emperors of the past and present, as these dictators find intellectual allies not only at home, but among theorists here too, one might consider jumping overboard the decolonial ship, if just to make the heaving stop. We are living through an era of decolonial vertigo. The most pronounced symptom to me is intellectual nausea. I think this decolonial vertigo obscures our ability to see ourselves clearly in relationship to ourselves and other selves in the universe, as Wathiongo suggested that liberation should do. What would this authentic, unclouded relational vision yield if we could see beyond the fog of decolonizing slogans mobilized by diametrically opposed camps? For us, as scholars invested in this region and its history and its future, for us as humanists, for us with relative privilege enough to be here in this room right now, what can we do to slow the dizzying effects of this battle of liberatory discourses? I'll share a few remedies that bring occasional, if insufficient, relief to me, with an open invitation to anyone who would like me to help me improve them. The first, to use the case studies from the region we all study to imagine a fairer and less violent future beyond the normative inheritances of the post-World War II and post-Soviet order. 3 anchors assist me in thinking through the Ukrainian case in these terms. The first is Mark von Hagen's 1995 call to consider Ukraine's history in order to challenge the nation-state's conceptual hegemony and to explore some of the most contested issues of identity formation, cultural construction and maintenance, and colonial institutions and structures, end quote. The second comes via the anthropologist Gary Wilder, who in his book Freedom Time points out that thinkers often, quote, treat the meaning of decolonization as self-evident by reducing colonial emancipation to national liberation. Underlying such dyadic accounts is the assumption that European states had empires, but were not themselves empires, end quote. Wilder traces the intellectual history of the poet-politicians Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor between the years 1945 to 1960, assessing how these 20th century intellectuals articulated their visions for a post-imperial order otherwise. Césaire and Senghor both argued for a reconfiguration of the relationship between the French colonies and the French imperial metropole, refigured not as hierarchical, but as equal and interdependent partners, an arrangement that may have impeded the neo-colonial dependencies that followed from this period of decolonization in both Martinique and Senegal. Wilder argues that both men sought to trouble the very stability of the category of France itself. I think we would do well to think about sovereignty and self-determination in our region through frameworks sympathetic to these, to trouble the category of Russia itself, and to lift up thinkers on the periphery who imagine more equitable worlds. To this end, I am also anchored by the ongoing work and struggle of those Ukrainian activists and scholars who live in the uncomfortable gray zones, acknowledging the hegemonies crowding Ukrainians from all sides, who challenge the presumed isomorphism between nation and state, and who do not pretend to have all the answers. Those unwilling to label any acts that are defensive of Ukraine as ethno-nationalistic while upholding the historical fact of Ukraine's multilinguistic, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic pasts and present. I am anchored by those activists who reject the neo-colonial projects of the US and Europe and the terrifying neo-imperialism of Russia. Those who conduct careful materialist analysis and or culturalist analysis without resorting to simplistic interpretations of the Soviet past. I seek intellectual allies that act against the violent epistemologies of purification baked into our political modernity, that name aggression and assess power in real terms, and find ways to defend minority languages, minority cultures, and ways of life that are non-hegemonic, but may teach us important things about not only how to survive, but how to live better together. 2, this is a much shorter point. No matter what happens in the near or distant future in this brutal war with its unimaginable loss of life and physical destruction, I hope that we as scholars will continue to do our part to narrate the Ukrainian fight against 21st century Russian aggression as a courageous reaction to an unjust invasion, and one that all relevant imperial actors predicted would be lost even before it began. Neither the Kremlin nor the Pentagon in the weeks leading up to February 24th, 2022, correctly predicted the future. Nobody did. It was Ukrainians who fought the Russian army back. 3, we must provincialize Russia in our scholarly work and in our institutional homes. We must be attuned to the imperial logics embedded in so much of the world of Slavic studies, from the ways Russian departments attract non-Russian students by over-promising on the exceptional greatness of the language and literature and music, to the ways we teach our classes, to the ways we select and frame our objects of study, to the lazy elision of Soviet and Russian in books, to the way we draft job descriptions and welcome future scholars into the field. And last, 4th, we should find ways to engage in what Olufemi Taiwo, in his diagnostic of the problem of elite capture, calls constructive politics, or a politics of building things. This might mean coming up with shared goals as a society of scholars and then pursuing these goals through practical and material gains. One can imagine goals taking many forms, from the obvious need to improve the Academy's labor practices, the goal of restoring something as basic as dignity and fair compensation for colleagues in the precarious classes of academics, to advocating for more faculty lines in underrepresented fields and more resources to support students who want to pursue those fields. Or perhaps this could be something more directly linked to the epistemological challenge of provincializing Russia by creating more equitably compensated platforms and pipelines for colleagues who productively trouble the very category of Russia. I feel strongly that we must not become sloganeers of liberation, but rather to find ways to live in the epistemic murk that marks this era of decolonial vertigo and to push past its disorienting effects. This means not only imagining liberation from structures of domination, but also building power towards a future liberation grounded in the practical realization of our shared goals, which hopefully align with a vision for a more accurate representation of the past and present, and more clarity on what a just future could look like. I was delighted to learn that a common treatment for vertigo is to perform what are called repositioning maneuvers of the head. Doctors teach patients with vertigo to perform these maneuvers, and then they are empowered to do them at home. I think it is past time that we as a society come up with some repositioning maneuvers of our own, and I'll look forward to continuing that conversation with you. Thank you.